science began to take shape in the form that we know it now, and they wanted to separate themselves off, understandably, from superstition. So they didn't want anything to do with something that sounds like the biblical flood, for example. They felt they would be contaminated by that, and they preferred to explain any cataclysmic evidence as a result of gradual processes.
So you really think it's because of the reluctance to accept religion or religious ideas, or to separate themselves from
I think that's where it started. They wanted to separate themselves off from that. Now they've gone a long way from that, and many scientists have got a vested interest in what is called uniformitarianism or gradualism, and they don't like to hear about cataclysms having any major impact on the story of life on Earth.
So is it sort of the momentum of these initial desires to escape religious influence that have sort of led them down this path?
Yes, and then there are others who have a vested interest in current accounts of global warming, others who have a vested interest in extinctions taking place now. They want to say that our ancestors were responsible for the extinction of all the mammoths and mastodons and so on and so forth. Whereas the Comet Research Group scientists are saying, no, those huge megafauna of North America were wiped out as a result of the massive series of impacts on the North American ice cap.
I'm reading a book right now by Dan Flores, a really interesting book called Coyote America. He's a wildlife historian, and he is really an expert on all the different forms of wildlife in North America, where they originated, where they migrated to. And one of the more fascinating things about it is he's talking about all these animals that went extinct, 10,000 plus years ago, this mass extinction event, and never once does he bring up cataclysms, and there's all these different ideas, and one of the big ones being the human beings with atlatls, which is like really a very weird sort of a spear throwing device, wiped out the woolly mammoths and all these other animals. And
to me, it's a lunatic idea. Also, if you have any contact with hunter-gatherers today, you find that hunter-gatherer peoples don't overkill their game. They hunt them respectfully, they take what they need, and they leave the rest because it's a renewable resource for them. So I don't think hunter-gatherers wiped out the mammoths in North America. The evidence is compelling against the comment.
Well, the evidence that you brought up when you were here the first time, when you showed the images of all those mammoths that had been literally knocked over with broken legs from the impact of something, and mass burial grounds, like these mass, not burial grounds, obviously, but mass casualties, mortality sites.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, in fact, Gray and I visited one up in South Dakota called Hot Springs, where there's just several dozen. Nobody knows how many are actually there, but there's at least several dozen two species, woolly mammoths and Columbian mammoths, that have been entombed. And while we were there, interestingly, the guide, the woman giving us the tour, there was kind of giving a gradualist explanation, and well over long periods of time, these mammoths wandered into a sinkhole and were too dumb to get out, so they became entombed. And I asked the question, well, what studies have been done on the sedimentary matrix in which their remains are being found? Because as I'm looking at this sedimentary matrix, I'm seeing a massive deposit. In other words, a deposit that was instantaneous. And when I brought that up, she actually got very irritated. Dismissed my question, didn't, well, we've got it all worked out, we know about that. Well, what is it? Well, we've got it all worked out, and immediately went on with her narrative. But yet I had an article that was actually written by one of the original scientists who worked on the site, and his description was, well, it could have been that, but also as an alternative, he used the term bloat and float, that what you had was woolly mammoths that had been caught in a flood, drowned, and their bloated carcasses floated into a depression in the landscape, and that's where they were entombed. And that makes a whole lot more sense to me than the fact that, individually over several thousand years, these mammoths wandered into this sinkhole and then couldn't get out. But you got to bear in mind, we're talking about, at the end of the last ice age, 120 roughly species of megafauna that disappeared, which is about equivalent to the same number of megafaunal species that inhabits the Earth today.
Well, it was a short period of time, with something like 65% of the North American mammals went extinct? 75%. Very short period of time, right?
Very short period of time. Pretty much totally coincident with that period called the Younger Dryas.
And so there's nothing resembling what we're capable of doing today back then. I mean, when you look at human extinction events, human-caused extinction events, it's very logical. And what we're doing today with pollution and the expanse of civilization and weapons are super sophisticated. If we wanted to, we could wipe out a lot of different species.
Yeah, but what we're actually seeing is that at the end of what's called the Balaram, which was the gradual warming at the end of the last ice age that preceded the sudden catastrophic change in 12,800, was the Clovis culture that existed for 300 to 500 years, I think.
Yes.
Somewhere. But they suddenly were gone, right? Exactly simultaneous with the mammoths. And then there are interesting studies that are coming out now showing that at least continental-wide, there was apparently a major human population crash, exactly coincident with the megafaunal extinctions, because you had quarries that had been mined for centuries that are suddenly abandoned. You have campsites that had been that had generations of debris and toolkits accumulating and so on, debris from the fluting of the spear points and so on, that are suddenly abandoned, right? So the evidence actually suggests that the human population crashed, which would certainly imply that they would have been far less capable of wiping out all of these species of megafauna. Also, the studies of their diet and their life ways suggest that they were quite diverse. They were hunter-gatherers, and they focused mostly on small game. They ate a lot of fish, a lot of shellfish. They gathered food. And why would they go after the biggest, most dangerous animal, in the whole array of animals?
And with incredible efficiency, hunt them to extinction in 100 years. It doesn't make sense.
No, it makes no sense.
It seems pretty silly. And
something
especially
else from that time, if I may say, Randall mentioned the Clovis culture. This is, for a very long time, really until just a couple of years ago, all of the mainstream academics in the fields of archaeology and anthropology were saying there were no human beings in North America before, let's say, 13,000 years ago, give or take 500 years. So they came across the Bering Land Bridge. The Bering Strait at that time was above water, sea level was lower. They entered the Americas then, they weren't here then before. Now in the last 2 to 3 years, there's just been a whole raft of new scientific research, and no scientist today is prepared to defend the Clovis model anymore. It's accepted, of course, that there have been human beings in America for 50,000, 60,000 years, and there's weird genetic links. Like, for example, there's a trace that connects Aboriginal Australians with North Americans. They had a common ancestor. It's a very peculiar thing that's going on. And so what happens is that actually these scientific models, which constrain and restrict research for so long, do get overthrown. And that Clovis model is being overthrown. And what the missing piece of the puzzle, I think, for everybody working in this field is the cataclysm, the comet, what happened between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, which changed everything.
Is it like bizarre to you guys or frustrating in any way that this is not a mainstream idea? This is very much fringe, but yet it's not something that we don't have any evidence.
Whenever I put out a book, immediately there's this huge hostile reaction.
Like the Michael Shermer thing.
Like the Michael Shermer thing. I would say Magicians of the Gods, which I published in 2015, which deals with this whole comet issue, is actually the most thoroughly documented, the most thoroughly referenced book that I've ever written. It's calm, it's measured. They actually don't read it. They just say, oh, Hancock's brought out another book. He's a pseudoscientist. That's what they always call me, or a pseudo-archaeologist. And it's obviously rubbish because it disagrees with everything that we know. Well, that's the point of the heretic in society, is to offer an alternative view and well-documented evidence. But it seems that we're dealing with such a deeply ingrained mindset, which is connected in curious ways to power structures in our society, that it's very difficult to change it.
Absolutely. And like Graham mentioned earlier, there's kind of it went from a religious motive, I think, in the 19th century. Now it's more political. And again, the idea that every day you'll find something, coming from various factions that, we're destroying the earth, and the earth has never suffered this kind of, assault on it before, and we're causing the 6th great mass extinction, and we're going to cause catastrophic global warming if we pump another 50 or 100 parts per million of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so what that has done is, like many, I won't say many, but several of the scientists now that have been in the forefront of criticizing the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis are also very much involved in the global warming movement and the idea that we are now precipitating the 6th great mass extinction. having looked now at mass extinctions and been really an obsession of mine for about 30 years now, I've looked at everything from the Cretaceous, Tertiary, the Permian, Triassic, right on down the line to the most recent one, which to me is really in some ways the most interesting, because the most recent mass extinction we're talking about is the one that took place while we humans were part of the story. And
between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas.
Yes, the Younger Dryas, which is still an unexplained climate anomaly that happened. And I mentioned this, I think, in a previous broadcast, that, what you had was you had a spasm of extreme warming followed by rapid shifting into extreme cold, literally within a matter of a few years. And we're talking about climate changes that are up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within perhaps 1 to 5 years, which utterly dwarfs anything that we've experienced in the last since the Industrial Revolution began. And we still don't really understand. And that's why this research is so important, because now we understand that there was something cosmic that happened. It's left its imprint in the landscape over, 4 continents, 5 continents?
Yeah, over 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. There's a giant debris field of there's stuff that is only produced by massive impacts. These things come in at 70,000 miles an hour. And, if they have any diameter at all, if they're 100 meters or more in diameter, they are going to hit the Earth really hard. They're not going to burn up in the atmosphere. And when they do, they pack a huge amount of kinetic energy, a huge amount of heat and shock, and that creates very definite chemical products. So nanodiamonds, so carbon spray, so melt glass, that's like the trinitite that was produced in nuclear explosions. All of these, when they're all found together in the same layer of soil, and when you can put a date on that layer of soil, and when it's all over the world, there's only one thing that can explain it: a massive pressure.
I don't understand why this is controversial. I really don't. I mean, I do. I understand this because I know that once people start teaching things, once people start doing lectures and speeches, they do want to stick to their guns. They want to somehow or another avoid anything that's going to happen.
This is a game. This information, it changes everything. It changes the way we looked at our past. It changes the whole story about what it is. It changes the way we look at the future. I think that people are reluctant to embrace that change. And they're afraid of being called pseudoscience. So there's a whole lobby of skeptics who use this word pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeologists as an instant dismissal of other ideas. And those who are in the profession, they don't want to get tarred with that brush. They want to keep themselves clean and
I understand that, but you're talking about hard evidence.
Yeah.
You're talking about this nuclear glass. You're talking about nanodiamonds. You're talking about core samples that show this massive shift. When you do the ice core samples, massive shift in temperature. And you're talking about very clear evidence of impacts that we know exist. It's not like the comets of theory. It's not like it's Bigfoot or something. Like, we're looking for the final piece of evidence that shows the comet is a real thing.
Exactly.
It's real.
It's totally real, but it's so difficult for those who are invested in other models to accept. And unfortunately, they have the ear of the media. By the way, all the scientists in the Comet Research Group are absolutely mainstream scientists, and they have taken a lot of flack from their colleagues for even daring to investigate this area. That's why they've had no funding. They've had to fund themselves all the way along.
That is so crazy. Because this is not a controversial thing in my mind.
It should not be.
It should not be. This is not an airy-fairy thing. We're not talking about psychics. We're not talking about UFOs. We're talking about something we know exists. So to bury your head in the sand or something like this
seems to be invested in vested interest. Right now, NASA is spending the equivalent of one attack helicopter a year on investigating the comet and asteroid danger. $50 million a year. That's not that much. It's peanuts. It's tiny. It's a minuscule sum. Hundreds of billions of dollars on massive, sophisticated military equipment, which we can use to slaughter one another in ever more sophisticated ways. But just $50 million a year on saving the Earth from a potential cataclysm that can put our civilization back into the Stone Age tomorrow.
And I don't mean to keep harping on Michael Shermer because I like Michael, but that he highlights this sort of natural inclination to poke fun at something that he has done no research on whatsoever. When I pointed out to Rabbi Rothschild and I sent him some articles from National Geographic, He went radio silent. I mean,
He should know about it. It's astonishing the number of people who
mocking it.
Yeah,
If you're gonna mock it, you should actually know what you're mocking.
and to say that Göbekli Tepe was created by hunter-gatherers, well, I'm sorry, that's just a theory. That's not a fact. I mean, you have a sophisticated site with astronomical alignments, with hundreds and hundreds of megalithic pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, the world's first perfectly aligned north-south building, which you can only do with astronomy. It's not enough to say, oh, they were just hunter-gatherers. There was something extraordinary.
From a half a mile away. I mean, there's some serious sophistication. How big are these stones?
Well, the biggest one actually is still in the quarry. They left it because it had a fault in it. They clearly intended to move it 50 tons. You're looking at 20-foot high objects, and then it's the putting together of them. See, here's the problem. Hunter-gatherer societies are not the kinds of societies that produce large-scale fixed monuments. Why? Because they don't generate a surplus. You can't pay for somebody to become an architect and for of those times, somebody to become an astronomer. You're busy hunting and gathering, and that's what you do. Agriculture generates a surplus, and that is the problem at Göbekli Tepe, because there is no background. This site just appears out of nowhere amidst what appears to be a hunter-gatherer community, but what they're not considering is the possibility we're looking at a technology transfer, that the survivors of a lost civilization who already had all that knowledge came to Göbekli Tepe and use that site as a center of initiation to teach the local hunter-gatherers how to do agriculture. And that's now taken as the beginnings of civilization. I would say it is the reinvention or the remaking of civilization.
So when we're looking back at Sumer and any artifacts we find in ancient Mesopotamia in that area, those were reinvention.
When we talk of Mesopotamia, which is between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, Göbekli Tepe is sitting right there in the headwater between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and we cannot separate that from the later cultures that enter history 5,000, 6,000 years ago. They're part of the lineage that descended from Göbekli Tepe times. And what's fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is the way it doesn't fit, the way there's no background to it, that you would expect to see them practicing, learning architectural skills. The oldest stuff should be the worst, and as they carry on, it gets better. That site ran for 1,000 years. The best stuff is the oldest. 1,000 years later, what they were producing wasn't so good. This is a real anomaly. It needs to be investigated, not mocked by skeptics, but actually explored to consider maybe this does rock the whole paradigm.
And it's kind of ironic that in their desire to get away from the ancient myths and tales of the Bible, they've ignored those ancient myths and tales which all talk about cataclysms.
Well, part of our modern psychology is to imagine that we are somehow so far advanced from our predecessors that we now represent the pinnacle of civilization, and anything that preceded us has to be looked upon almost as, as if the world is children. It requires a major psychological shift to admit or accept that our ancestors have been far, far more sophisticated than we had imagined in our 19th century models, which basically still dominate thinking today. And, in Graham's book, he devotes several chapters to the story of 20th century heritage, J. Harlan Brett. And his story, to me, kind of encapsulates the whole process of forcing his paradigm shift. And for years, he was out there exploring this evidence that there had been this tremendous flooding in Washington State. And all of his critics were dismissive without ever even going out and looking at the evidence firsthand in the field. But what he did was he stuck to his guns for 3 decades and continued to amass evidence to the point where they just couldn't dismiss it anymore. And finally, a group of them went out and began to explore the landscapes for themselves. And one of the leaders, I think you talked about it in your book, James Galooly, who was sort of the leader of the skeptic faction that had set out. Their sole purpose was to discredit and lay this whole flood heresy to rest once and for all. But he went out in the field, and he spent about 8 days in the field, where he's seeing this evidence for himself over and over again. And when you look at just one piece of it, you might be able to say, okay, there's all other explanations for that. But what happens is when you get multiple lines of evidence all converging, and there's no way to individually explain away each one of those things other than just saying, oh, it's all coincidence. Well, this James Dooley was honest enough so that after a week out there, they were in a place called Police Falls in southern Washington, which was one of these areas where these tremendous inland tsunamis swept across the land. And I actually just visited there about 8 weeks ago. That took a group of people out there and took them to Police Falls to show them right on the spot where James Dooley was standing. He finally had his epiphany. I have the images. I can dig them up here. Yeah, I sure do. I've got some really interesting images to show. Which relates, see, this flooding stuff relates directly to the idea of the impact. And we can get into a little bit of that, explaining how these parallel lines of evidence are now converging. But the interesting thing about Dooley was that in the descriptions of the trip, he wandered off by himself for a long time, away from the group, and was standing there looking at this massive cataract with 400-foot cliffs and this little tiny ribbon of water flowing over it and this huge canyon below it and these big boulders. And he'd seen, for a whole week, he'd been seeing this stuff. And it finally got to the point where it was undeniable. And he walked back to the group and the words out of his mouth verbatim were, how could I have been so wrong? And he finally admitted. And that was like a turning point. And now, and again, Graham described this very effectively in the book, how in a way, the flooding phenomenon was hijacked and then placed within this more gradualistic context. To avoid the fact that it was something so anomalous and such a departure from our modern experience that we had to look outside of our modern experience to find an explanation. What they wanted to do was find something within our modern experience. And this is the cornerstone of the uniformitarian approach, is that we look for a modern example and then we extrapolate backwards from that. And so what they did was they said, well, in the modern world, we have glacial lakes that form from glaciers. And sometimes these glacial lakes might be held in by an ice dam or another glacier. These ice dams will give way and they will cause pretty catastrophic flooding. They're very common up in Iceland because you've got several volcanoes under the Icelandic ice sheets. And up there they use the term jökulhlaups to describe these outburst floods. But here's the thing. When you look at the modern versions of it, you basically are looking at floods that are less than 1,000th of one single flow from these floods we're talking about that happened, 12 to 13,000 years ago. 1,000. Less than 1,000. Less than 1,000 in peak discharge and in total volume. And so, it has been admitted in several places. I've extracted the quote saying, well, we do admit that this is a major extrapolation upwards, but never mind. We're going to never mind. It's so disturbing.
See, Harlan Bretz, for 30 years, was walking the walk in Thomas Kaplan, and what he saw was evidence for as he called it, that tremendous flood, which actually wasn't falling in 3 weeks. And he went through decades of being put aside by his colleagues, insulted. They mocked him, they laughed at him, just as the skeptics do today. But actually the evidence began to come out, they couldn't deny it anymore, that there had been flooding, and actually eventually they gave Harlan Bretz, J. Harlan Bretz, the Penrose Prize, the ultimate bestowal of geology, and he got the accolade. And he said at that, he was born more than 90 years old at that time. He said at that time, he said, all my enemies are dead, so I have no one left to gloat over. But the point is, in a way, there was nothing to gloat about, because what they did was they separated him from his central idea. Instead of accepting that there had been one huge flood, and that was always his view, they said, oh, there must be 70 or 80 floods that caused all this damage, and that's what we are seriously talking about. It's so alive in a way that the human desire for knowledge is what has led us to where we are today. We have this insatiable desire for knowledge and for innovation, but that same human desire to achieve is also what the ego is responsible for. And the ego blocks anything that's contrary to what you've already established as fact. So as soon as you see something that might throw a monkey wrench into the gears of what you've been teaching and practicing your whole life,
And I know that you've gone through this with Egypt, your whole issue with the space, with Dr. Shock and John Anthony West was on the podcast.
John was with you just recently.
Yeah, he's amazing.
By the way, I'm going to be doing an event in New York with John Anthony West.
When?
On the 29th of November.
Where?
It's linked on my website.
Okay.
The details are on the Talks and Events page. It's in some church somewhere, but I'm going to give a presentation and then I'm going to interview John live on stage. First time I've ever done that. Kind of podcasting.
He's such a character.
He's amazing.
I love that dude. And Magical Egypt is, I think, one of the most important things anybody can ever watch. I think that DVD series is just insane. It's so spectacular. It's so fantastic. And next to going to Egypt, which I haven't done, I think that's probably like the second best thing.
You bet. You bet. And John is an example of why we need heretics. This is the thing. You see that the science today. Yes, you're right. We have this thirst for knowledge of its human characteristics, but also we get invested in particular positions. And people criticize those positions. We take it as an existential threat, and we get all angry and bothered about it. If we allow that to happen, if we don't keep a place for heretics in our society, then we're never going to do anything about it. We're eventually going to get lost down, ossified into the existing system. We need heretics. John has been the leading heretic for decades, pointing out that we should listen to what the Egyptians said, that their civilization was not a development, it was a legacy. It was a legacy from the times of the gods. And that casts me back again to this whole issue of lost civilization.
Now, when Göbekli Tepe was discovered, it vindicated you in so many ways. But what are the possibilities, if any, of more of these sites being explored and exposed? I mean, are there more that people are looking at right now? Are there any that are under the radar?
Just a year ago, at the bottom of the Sicily Channel, at a depth of more than 120 feet, it's been underwater for at least 9,000 years, is a huge megalithic site. Before the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, that site could never have been explained. The dating is absolutely definite. The seas rose and covered it at least 9,000 years ago. We don't know how long it stood there before it was covered by the rising seas. But there it sits underwater, and I think underwater discoveries I've had a part to play in this over the years, are one of the ways forward. You need to look at those areas because there was a 400-foot rise in sea level at the end of the ice age. You're looking at the amount of land that would be put together in, say, Europe and China, added together. That amount of land was swallowed by those rising seas. And archaeology has largely proceeded without taking account of those lost lands. I'm not saying they haven't looked at all, but they're primarily in marine archaeology interested in shipwrecks.
Now, this megalithic site, is there images of this that we can look at?
There are, yeah. I can probably find it. Monolith at the bottom of the Sicily Channel. Try that. Search on that.
Pull it up, Gene. Yeah, but so what does this look like? Is this been clearly established that this actually is the work of man? Is this not some sort of a yardang or something?
Of course, there's dispute.
Right, of course.
But the mainstream is not going to just accept this overnight. But again, it's mainstream scientists who found it. They're absolutely certain that they're dealing with a man-made site. There are holes drilled through these megaliths. One of them is very, very large. There's a series of other megaliths round about. It's not a natural thing.
So here we're looking at some of it right now.
Yeah, so there's that big megalith broken into two parts right there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this we can say, again, often with archaeological sites, the problem is dating them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for example, there are incredible megalithic temples all over the island of Malta, not far away from this place. Incredible megalithic temples. But they can't date the stone directly. They have to date organic material associated with the stone, and that can give them misleadingly young dates. In the case of a site that's been covered by sea level rise, there can be no argument. Nobody went down there and built that 9,000 years ago.
Right.
It had to be built before the seas rose, and that puts a minimum age on it of 9,000 years.
What are the best images that we can look at? Because right now I'm just seeing rocks. It's very difficult because I'm looking at something very two-dimensional.
I'm afraid that's all you're going to see. Those are the best images of it that exist.
The Dapper one, right above that.
That's in Yonaguni. That's not in the Sicily Channel.
So, what are the biggest pieces down there? Is it this right here? Is this what you're?
Yeah, that big thing there. It's about 30 feet long.
And is it? What leads you to believe that this is man-made?
The scientists who worked on it, the fact that there are holes drilled through the stone, the fact that you can go to neighboring areas like Armenia and find really very ancient megalithic sites where they have exactly the same kind of holes drilled through the stones. And the holes seem to have been used for astronomical sightings. Now, this site's a mess. It's been knocked over by the sea. It's fallen down. But we're seeing the same thing, big megaliths with holes drilled through them.
And you're also dealing with 9,000 plus years of erosion and barnacle growth.
All of that. And the ocean is a difficult place to work. It's not easy. Visibility can be bad. You're dealing with currents. There's all kinds of problems.
But this is bring in James Cameron and his crazy little submarine.
Bring in James Cameron. Well, I spent 7 years scuba diving all around the world looking at this stuff. It's pretty convincing in my opinion.
Well, it does make sense that if we do know for a fact, and we do, that the sea level rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, it makes sense that some things would be buried under the water.
Well, and during the Ice Age, whatever, you don't have to talk about advanced civilizations or anything, but during the Ice Age, living on the coastlines and establishing your villages, communities, and everything on the coastlines would have been probably one of the most benign places to get, because for one thing, you're down near sea. The sea level, the presence of the seas is going to, smooth out the climate and so forth. So, you're going to have probably most cultural development during the Ice Age is going to be close to the sea. So it's going to be underwater, just like Graham was talking about. And so this, to me, is probably the future of archaeology, is marine archaeology, where a lot of discoveries are going to be made. And in that particular thing, there's a lot of megalithic structures around the world that if you set that thing up like this and put those sighting holes through it, would look precisely like, scrape the barnacles off of it, and no one's saying, oh, it's proven. But what it is we have to keep an open mind and say, well, there are some very strong similarities here, so let's investigate this thing further. And that's the whole point of all this, is all of this stuff needs more research. It doesn't need some cavalier dismissal by somebody who's protecting their own paradigm. It needs more research on all fronts. Because I think that there's enough evidence that is now accumulated to suggest that there is a deep history to the human species on Earth. And we're just beginning to really appreciate how much deeper it really is than the conventional models of history. And rather than just waving an arm and dismissing this
with a skeptical sneer.
With a skeptical sneer, exactly.
What's interesting is that there is accepted scientific models of humanity when you're talking about supervolcanoes, right? Like the supervolcano of 60, 70,000 years ago.
Mount Toba.
Yeah, they pretty much accept that wiped out the vast majority of human beings on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And why is the supervolcano hypothesis so easily accepted, but yet the asteroidal impact? Both of them are real events. Both of them are historically documented. In fact, we've never watched a supervolcano take over the world, but we've seen asteroids hit other planets. We've actually watched Shoemaker-Levy, like you were talking about before.
Bombarding Jupiter, unbelievable.
They are impacting the planet Earth itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. So, and actually more than 20 impacts. Each one of them would have wiped out all life on Earth if that object had hit. So it's very. Another thing too, we're talking about underwater structures, but let's also consider the possibility, and here we don't have to address let's also consider the possibility that we have misidentified a number of structures that are standing in plain view, like the Great Sphinx. Egyptology, you read any Egyptological text, any encyclopedia actually, they will tell you that thing was put there by a specific pharaoh, Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty, around about 2500 BC. That is not a fact. That is an opinion. But it's presented as a fact. There is not a single inscription that relates the Sphinx to that pharaoh, not a contemporary inscription, not one dating from 2500 BC. In fact, there's nothing at all. It's just the assumption, because it's close to a pyramid, which they assume the same pharaoh built, again on the absence of evidence, that the Sphinx must have been built by them. Because John Anthony West was the first to see that actually when we look at the Sphinx, we're looking at a highly eroded stone object. And that erosion is very odd, and that's why he brought Professor Robert Schoch, Professor of Geology from Boston University, to Giza in 1992 to look at the Sphinx and say, what actually caused this weathering on the Sphinx? And Schoch immediately saw it. What caused it was exposure to a very long period of heavy rainfall. And no such rains have fallen in Egypt in the last 5,000 years, but they did fall during the Younger Dryas. we had a prolonged rainout from this comet impact as that ice cap was pulverized and a massive amount of ice water was thrown up into the upper atmosphere. A prolonged rainout, which could have been the cause of the
Now, what has occurred? What discoveries have been discovered in the last year? What is new that we can look at?
In terms of archaeology, there's not much new. Göbekli Tepe at the moment is in deep freeze. It's right 30 miles from the Syrian border. There's been massive unrest in Şanlıurfa, which is the main town. Archaeology is very difficult for them to carry on there. It's basically just frozen.
Where they just sort of stopped.
They've just kind of stopped. And in fact, there's an amazing number of these sites. Another site I visited for Magicians of the Gods was Baalbek in Lebanon. An absolutely stunning site. And again, I'm convinced that that site is nuanced. It is, yes, there is a Roman temple there, but they put that temple there because the site was sacred long before. And there's this incredible U-shaped megalithic wall which surrounds Baalbek, which does not appear to have any connection to the Roman structure at all. Again, that's an area which is subject to tremendous unrest and difficulty. It's difficult for archaeologists to proceed. But just in 2014, they made a huge new discovery at Baalbek of a buried block which weighs 1,460 tons, which was sitting there on the site. They've been working that site for 100 years now. 1,460.
Is that 2 million pounds?
So this thing, maybe that was math better than mine, converting it into pounds.
1 ton is 2,000 pounds. Yeah, 2,000 pounds to a ton, to an imperial ton. So whatever had 3 zeros on it, double it and had 3 zeros on it.
It's a horrendous amount of pounds. Put it that way. It's the single largest block of stone ever cut and quarried in the ancient world.
And they found this just in 2014.
They found it in 2014. Now there's another big one right beside it, which has been in plain view for about the last 100 years. And it's astonishing to me that this one, which is just below it, was covered by sediment.
You have an actual calculator? You can do half or so less. I never go anywhere without my calculator.
You have a real calculator. Nobody has one of those. We were just talking about that yesterday. They're like, who the fuck
It's
buys
not an
calculators?
it's an actual
I
calculator.
gotta be the last guy. Take care of who it is.
Wow. So Baalbek was also the site of, there's many monoliths that have been discovered there, and it's a really fascinating site that many people sort of overlooked when we talk about ancient structures from the past.
I had to resist. I've got nothing against aliens, but I don't need aliens to explain these things. I think a much leaner and more elegant explanation for these huge archaeological anomalies is a lost human civilization. Much better. Yeah, that's been the case that I've been making for 25 years. I think that the alien thing is a bit of a distraction. Of course there's aliens, of course the universe is full of life, but the ancient archaeological sites are not good evidence for that idea. They're very, unless you mass archaeology, they're not good evidence. So I think we are dealing with a lost human civilization and that Baalbek, 20 feet above the ground. We have 3 blocks of stone, joined so closely together that you can't get it. Edge of a sheet of paper between them. Each one weighs more than 900 pounds, and they are 20 feet above. It's a stunning achievement. It's just absolutely astonishing. How on earth did they do that?
And how does mainstream archaeology deal with that?
They say, the Romans did this. The Romans. The Romans did do some awesome stuff. They did do some awesome stuff. They absolutely did. But this site is separate from the Roman site. It's surrounded. It's not part of it.
In terms of your question, what's happened within the last year, I would think that probably the most significant thing, we're certainly right up there would be the comet research and the discovery. I mean, like this article I have right here, which came out in 2014, so it's not that old. A nano diamond rich layer across 3 continents consistent with major cosmic impact at 12,800 years ago. And it's something like 24, 25 highly pedigreed scientists.
And these are the Comet Research Group. These are the scientists from the Comet Research Group who have funded all their research themselves. They came out with another paper in 2015.
Where was this published, if anybody wants to read this?
That's in the Journal of Geology.
Yeah.
But then there's the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, host a lot of their work as well. And Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences get into trouble for hosting their work, but they feel it's important, so they keep on hosting.
This is so spectacularly confusing to me because that's rock solid science.
Yeah.
And this is evidence. This is actually, you can weigh this stuff. You can measure it. You can run tests on it and find out what its components are. This to me is so baffling.
Yeah, it's very baffling. They brought out another paper in 2015. I won't go into some of the details are boring, but it's called the Bayesian chronological analysis. And basically, what they were looking at is they asked themselves, is it possible that this evidence, these nanodiamonds, these delta the carbon failures, could that be laid down gradually? And the chronological analysis that they've done absolutely answers that. No, it was not laid down gradually. This whole thing unfolded in a period of about 24 hours.
Whoa! What a night.
So, yeah, what had happened, Joe, is that for years, archaeologists had recognized this black mass layer at about 2 dozen or more of sites around North America, which are over 50 and stuff. And it was C. Vance Hayes who wrote an interesting paper saying that he was the one who noted that below this black mass layer, which is only 2 to 3 inches thick in most sites, you found evidence of the Clovis culture. You found their toolkits and their spear points and so on. You found evidence of the state megafauna, but not above. You would find this evidence of this cultural activity and the megafauna right up to the bottom of the black mat layer, but not above it. So what finally happened was in 2007, Richard Firestone and Alan West and some of their colleagues, and it was just basically a small group at that point, took a look at this closer look. And that's when they began to discover these impact proxies, usually right at the base of the layer. And the layer itself is carbonaceous, which suggests that there had been a lot of soot deposited, which would imply widespread wildfires. In fact, there's a study right off the coast of California on the Santa Rosa Islands that pretty much concluded that there was these massive wildfires that were just annihilating everything. And then this was preceded by the deposition of this black mat layer. Right at the bottom of this black mat layer, you find the nanodiamonds, the magnetic grains, the microspherules, the carbonaceous spherules, fullerenes. You find these impact proxies, and they're not all the same at all the sites. In fact, that's been one of the things that the critics have seized upon. But what they're doing is, I think, taking an oversimplified model. And when you look at a comet fragmentation event, you could be looking at the individual pieces could have very different compositions. And what we were talking about earlier, the Torah Peters group, I'm not convinced at this point that it was necessarily just a single impact event. It may have been a bombardment episode that may have lasted even several decades. It may have been ceased for a while. And we were talking about this last night over dinner, that there seems to be a second spasm at 11,600 years ago. It's also associated with a massive rise in sea level. They call there's 2 meltwater spikes, meltwater spike 1A and meltwater spike 1B. I'm quite convinced that these meltwater spikes that have been documented by marine geologists and oceanographers are correlated with these melting events of the ice sheet that I've been looking at in terms of their geomorphic consequences. Because some of these events, I mean, the only way I can describe some of these meltwater events is that the only modern analog to this would be a tsunami. And we've seen some pretty devastating tsunamis within the last decade or two, both in Indonesia and in Japan. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of the videos of these tsunamis. Anybody listening, it is definitely worthwhile to go online and look at some of these videos where you can actually see the unbelievably powerful effects of a 30 or 40 or 50 foot tsunami, right? Now, some of the landscapes, and I have some images we can pull up here shortly, are places in Montana, Idaho, Washington, where you literally had a tsunami sweeping over the land. It was over 1,000 feet deep.
And that tsunami came off the ice cap. That's not an oceanic tsunami. That's
right. It's a freshwater tsunami. It's meltwater coming off this catastrophic melting of the ice sheet. And I traced the sources of some of these meltwater. I made 2 trips now into the plateau country, British Columbia, looking for the source of this meltwater. Because in the conventional models of this flood, that goes back to Harlan Brett's, and basically what they've done is they said initially there could have been no flood because Harlan Brett's didn't provide a source for the water. They said, the critics said, well, you're saying that all of this evidence in the landscape is evidence of the flood, but what was the source of the flood? He didn't have a source. So the critics then said, well, you don't have a source for the flood water, therefore the flood didn't take place. Then as research evolved, you had independent evidence accumulating in western Montana by J.T. Pardee, who was with the U.S. Geological Survey. And he was investigating evidence that the mountain valleys of western Montana had been filled up with an enormous volume of water. And this volume of water seemed to be exactly the same time as Brett's floods. He then assumed that this was a giant lake. And because you can see, and we can, I think we have some images, I think Jamie has some images, so we'll pull them up shortly. We're on the mountainside, you see the shorelines etched, 1,000 feet above the valley floor. And what he then decided was that based upon an old 19th century interpretation by T.C. Chamberlain, that there had been an ice dam, he said, well, there must have been an ice dam west of here somewhere in the Clark Fork Valley. A giant lake backed up, burst through the ice dam, and then this is what would have caused Harlan Brett's floods. So now the geological community is shifting because, number one, the evidence is overwhelming, and they can't deny it anymore. But what they're doing is looking for a gradualist or a more uniformitarian explanation. So they immediately latched onto this, well, there's a giant pro-glacial or in front of a glacial lake in western Montana. Well, you're talking about somewhere between 520 and 550 cubic miles of water. That's a lot, right? If you normally read of a large lake, you have a huge catchment basin that is feeding lots of streams and rivers that are feeding into that lake. When you look at the big lakes around North America, you have the lake, and then you have this big old catchment basin, and all of that's feeding. In Lake Missoula, the whole lake fills almost the whole catchment basin. It's like, to me, what they did was they said, okay, we're just going to push the source of the water from here over to here, but let's not go into the question of where did the water come from that's filling these mountain valleys of western Montana. And this is what I spent a couple of weeks in September, going up into some of these, following these valleys up into British Columbia. And there's spectacular evidence. And it's almost like the American geologists stop at the 49th parallel. And they say, well, that's the Canadians preserve up there. We'll let them, they've got their own theories, we've got ours. Interestingly, the Canadians are saying that we think that the water for these floods came from up here. But they don't like that because, you see, one of the leading geologists who's saying that these floods came from Canada is John Shaw, who basically came up with this idea that drumlins, which are these inverted boat hull-shaped landforms that are found by hundreds of thousands in regions where glaciers were, that they were formed not by the glaciers grinding over the landscape, but they were actually formed by massive subglacial flows of water. And his critics have all been saying, well, here's the problem. What's the source of your water? Therefore, it wasn't water, it wasn't subglacial floods. It parallels the Harlan Brett's story very closely. Well, here's the thing. Shaw and his colleagues couldn't really come up with a plausible explanation for how you could form these massive subglacial reservoirs. In fact, what they call the Livingstone Lake event required 84,000 cubic kilometers of water. And 84,000 kilometers, I can do it really quickly here. We divide that by 36. That's about 2,300 cubic miles of water. That's more than all of the Great Lakes combined. Vastly bigger than all of the Great Lakes combined. It's probably every lake in North America combined. And he said this one event required over 2,000 cubic miles of water. Well, where did that water come from? So he basically said, well, there must have been a reservoir somehow that formed. His critics have said, that's impossible. You couldn't form that much water under the ice sheet. Well, what's happened now is the idea of a major cosmic impact into the ice sheet has completely obviated the need for a subglacial reservoir, because now we have a way of instantaneously melting enormous volumes of ice.
It's no longer a mystery where the water came from. It's fully explained, and this has been the missing piece of the puzzle until the Comet Research Group began to identify this evidence.
Well, it's baffling to me that this is a source of controversy, because we know that the Great Lakes were created by melting glaciers. We also know that there's vast areas of North America that are flat by these glaciers. You know, a buddy of mine, my friend Doug, lives in Cazenovia, Wisconsin, which is what's called the driftless area, where the glaciers didn't go through.
I just was there in May.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Rolling hills, and it's just it wasn't crushed flat like other parts of North America was. Right. So we know that those glaciers melted and created the Great Lakes. I mean, the Great Lakes were from glaciers. We know that. Right. That's an established fact. So why is all this confusing? I just don't understand why they wouldn't just add that to it. They're just going to accept the glaciers. Somehow or another, in the last 10,000 years, the glaciers just decided to stop smashing North America flat and melt and create these great inland oceans of fresh water.
That was wrong. It's very bizarre. Ultimately, a lot of ideology is involved in this. There's this desire, also in the modern world, there's a desire not to panic the public, not to say things that are going to cause panic. You know,
with Donald Trump being president, I think people are ready now.
I think people are ready for panic. I think so.
But sir, has anybody debated you on this? Either one of you on this?
Well, you know, I tried to, but not specifically on this. I tried to do a debate with Zahi Hawass, who's the guy who runs the Giza pyramids, and that, total. I mean, very crazy event.
There's a video of it online.
There's a video of it online.
The debate lasts 30 seconds.
It's something like that. Yeah. And then later on, when he finally agreed to come back into the room because he was so angry with me, he walked out. When he finally came back into the room, he was asked a question about Göbekli Tepe, and just like your skeptic, he didn't know anything about Göbekli Tepe. Or he claimed not to know about it. I mean, this is supposed to be the world's most famous Egyptologist, and he knew nothing about this incredible site in a neighboring country. But one point to make, the Rabbi was talking about the second event, 11,600 years ago. We're dealing with an episode of cataclysm, which begins 12,800 years ago and ends 11,600 years ago. Both episodes accompanied by massive floods. And the 11,600 years ago date, I may have mentioned this last year, it's in Magicians of the Gods. What's interesting about that is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Plato, that's the only source we have for Atlantis. It comes to us, many people think it's all over the place, but it's not. Atlantis comes to us from the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived around 340 BC. And he got the story through his family line, from his ancestor Solon, who had visited Egypt in 600 BC. And there Solon was told of a great civilization that had existed on Earth, that was the progenitor civilization of Egypt, but that was destroyed in a terrible cataclysm. And he asked, a cataclysm involving a gigantic flood, and Atlantis was submerged beneath the waves and was never seen again. And so Solon said to the priests, when did this happen? And they said 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC, so that's 9,600 BC, that's 11,600 years ago. That's not what a pulse would be. How could they know? Yeah, how could they? We have to start taking this stuff more seriously. Instead of sneering at it and skepticizing it out of existence, we need to leave a little bit of room for extraordinary ideas possibly being right. That's the main beef I have with the skeptics, is that they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I want to add something to that. In the Timaeus, Plato discusses Atlantis in 2 dialogues. And in the Timaeus, he prefaces the story of Atlantis by recounting the myth of Phaeton. Now, the myth of Phaeton is a very interesting story. And basically what it is Phaeton was the offspring of Helios, the sun god, who was raised, didn't know who his father was. His mother kept it a secret from him, and then one day he was being taunted at school because all of his schoolmates had, recounting the great deeds of their father and everything. So he went home distraught. Finally, his mother said, well, actually, your father is the big granddaddy of them all, Helios, the sun god. So Phaeton decides he's going to go and find his father. And he eventually does, and he goes to some, celestial realm where his father is located. And the way it is with the Greek gods, they have unlimited powers, except they also have certain restrictions. For example, if a god makes a promise, he or she cannot go back on it, right? So when Helios sees Phaeton, his lost son, come, he's overjoyed. He says, I'm so happy to see you. I will grant you any boon you want. And Phaeton says, I want to drive the chariot to the sun. I want to drive your chariot. And Helios says, well, I meant anything you wanted except that. So it goes back and forth and back and forth. Finally, Phaeton convinces his father, let me do it. His father says, look, you've got to hang on to those reins tight because those steeds are going to pull away from you. He gets in there, the gates of the sun open. It describes, in the myth, you can go, you can read Edith Hamilton or Bullfinch or any of the great retellings of the Greek myths, and they'll describe it in there. It goes through the signs of the zodiac, and then all of a sudden it careens off and heads down to Earth. And then it describes this whole litany of catastrophes, just setting the Earth on fire. And finally, the Jupiter at the beseeching of Poseidon, and was afraid that the oceans are going to boil away, gets Zeus to mount his Mount Olympus and hurl his thunderbolt, which knocks Phaeton from the sky, and he falls to Earth and falls into the river Eridanus, which is a metaphor for the Milky Way. And his sisters, the Heliades, then weep over the death of their brother, and their tears fall to Earth and cause the great flood. Plato then, after referencing that myth, he then says, now this has the form of a myth, but what it really represents is a declination or a declining of the bodies in space orbiting around the Earth, and an eventual falling to Earth of one of those bodies, and a conflagration of all things triggered by the fall of that body.
It's intriguing that he mentions the zodiac, because the Tauride meteor stream is so cold, because it appears to come at us from the direction of the constellation of Taurus, the zodiacal constellation. That's where those shooting stars, amongst which are some very large objects that have hit us in the past but can hit us again in the future, that's where they come from. They come from that area of the sky.
It's actually an illusion. It appears that they're not actually coming from Taurus.
It looks like that. They come from that area of the sky.
They come from that area of the sky. And so anybody in ancient times who was witnessing, and according to the Victor Klube and William Napier and those guys who are the British neo-catastrophists that have been doing all of this work for decades on the Tauride meteor shower, have concluded that, in times past, it was an extremely active shower and would have created some pretty darn impressive light shows, even if it wasn't causing catastrophes down here below. But what they've conjectured is that there might be times of multiple Tunguska-like impact bombardment when, there could be thousands of objects within the Tauride meteor stream on the same scale as the Tunguska object. And that, if you go and you read the accounts, the eyewitness accounts, over and over again, people are saying things like, well, it looked like it was being disgorged from the sun. It looked like it was being born out of the sun, right? It looked like a second sun in the sky. Like, for a short period of time, the sun had a twin, right? Well, the summertime Taurids are coming from their perihelion passage around the sun. So like Graham was saying, they make an elliptical orbit out to Jupiter and back around the sun in this stream, right? Earth crosses that stream twice each year. One time, late June, early July, we cross, but at that point, they're coming from the direction of the sun. So their arrival to Earth is going to be very difficult to see because they're coming from the direction of the sun, right? But that's exactly where, on June 30th, a Tauride meteor would be coming from. And then also the fact that it's the perfect day for the peak of the shower and the correct place in the sky, to me, is pretty convincing evidence that it was most likely a remnant of that Tauride stream. The other time that the Earth crosses is late October, early November. In fact, we just passed out of it within the last week, basically. But it peaks, interestingly, coincidentally, between like October 30th and November 4th or 5th. So it's peaking right around Halloween time. In fact, they've been called the Halloween meteors, and there's some very
Halloween fireworks sometimes they call them.
The Halloween fireworks, yeah. But there's some very interesting work done by a researcher back around the early 20th century named Grant Halliburton, who spent about 15 years researching the connections between ancient calendars. And he concluded one thing very interesting was that a lot of these ancient calendars were being synchronized by people's observations of the rise and fall of the Pleiades, which is the shoulder of the bull. The Pleiades comprises basically part of that constellation of the bull.
Taurus,
Yeah, the shoulder of the bull. And what he came up with was that in his research, he discovered that many of these stories that were associated with this, like the slaying of the celestial bull, Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the earliest known story, they fight the celestial bull. There's many counterparts and variants of that in mythical stories. And so what he then found out, though, was that in many cases, our modern Halloween actually goes back thousands of years to an ancient Day of the Dead that was observed all over the earth at the same time every year, even in the southern hemisphere. And it usually revolved around the commemoration of the culmination of the Pleiades, which is when the Pleiades crosses the local meridian. In other words, it reaches the keystone of the royal arch, so to speak, up in the sky. So if you go out on Halloween now and you face the south in the northern hemisphere, you will see the Pleiades right at midnight. At midnight, they will be, if you think of the arch of the zodiac as being like a clock, it's right there at midnight, right? Well, here's the interesting link, is that in all of these myths, what Halliburton discovered over and over again was that the Day of the Dead ultimately went back to myths of the destruction of the world by a great flood and or fire.
It's fascinating that it's all coming out of the constellation Taurus, too, and it's the celestial bull that they're fighting in these ancient myths, and all these cultures around the world are celebrating the Day of the Dead at this exact same time. It's amazing stuff.
And right now our science is closing its eyes to this. I think it's fair to say, with the Taurid meteor stream, which is a very big issue in this whole discussion, that we are dealing with a hidden hand in human history. It's something that is going to ultimately require us to re-explain almost everything. But the skeptics hate it. They can't bear it. Because, first of all, it involves cataclysms. And secondly, it involves the possibility of losing a whole civilization from the record. It's really interesting when you look at the dates of this cluster, this episode of bombardment between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the period that just immediately precedes what mainstream academia think of as the very beginnings of civilization. And they've just never, maybe it's not even their fault. This is so recent, this science is so new that they've not had time to adapt to it. But if they adapt to it and take this into account, then suddenly what was an extraordinary and absurd and impossible idea, that there was a lost civilization 12,000 years ago, becomes a very plausible and reasonable idea. And then we start, once we take that on board, then we can start opening our eyes to archaeological anomalies, like the Great Sphinx, like Baalbek, like submerged ruins, like Göbekli Tepe, and begin to consider, what does all this mean? Are we in fact a species with amnesia? Are we here forgetful of the truth about ourselves? Maybe that's why we're so fucked up, because we just actually don't know. We've made up a story about where we came from and what we are.
I certainly think it plays a part, and I also think that conservative skepticism is probably prudent when you're dealing with most scientific issues. Most things that come up that people are claiming, I mean, there's so many charlatans out there and crazy people that are claiming new discoveries, but in some cases, they examine these discoveries as long as they're far enough away from us or weird enough, like this new planet that they believe they have a 90+%. They're pretty sure there's something outside past the Kuiper Belt, and they think it's massive. They think it's at least 4 times, maybe larger than the United States, or then, the world.
They got an orbit of about 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And that's interesting with comets, because this huge, massive object circulating in the outer solar system through the Kuiper Belt, which is the source of many of the comets that hit the Earth, is destabilizing comets from safe orbits and putting them into really dangerous orbits that come our way.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what is the source of all these near-Earth objects? Does this have anything to do with Earth 1 and Earth 2? Does it have anything to do with the initial impact that created the moon? Is that because we were hit by another planet, right, during the formation of the Earth? And this is all scientifically established. Astroscientists, or astrophysicists rather, and astronomers all agree on that, right?
There's a lot of debris would go back to that time. But comets are another story because they're coming in from the far reaches of outer space. They're coming in from the Oort cloud and the Kuiper cloud, just vast distances away. They're voyagers. They're kind of messengers from the distant reaches of the cosmos who come in an unpredictable way because their orbits are destabilized by something like Planet 9.
Isn't there something called Bode's law where you can measure the mass and the orbit of a certain planet and you can accurately depict where the next planet is going to be? And doesn't that fall apart somewhere between Mars and Jupiter? So
the asteroid belt.
Yeah. Which would indicate that something was probably there.
That's in the theory of the asteroid belt, that it was an exploded planet. Of course, there's a lot of opposition to that theory too. You're right. Skepticism really has an important role to play. It's really essential that we are skeptical.
Otherwise, we'd all be following Zechariah Sitchin and waiting for the Anunnaki to land.
Exactly.
We would have sold our houses December 21st, 2012. We'd all be going, what the fuck, now I'm homeless.
Exactly.
4 years later.
And I have to say, there's a skeptic called Michael Heiser who's done really an excellent job of thoroughly debunking the bogus translations of Zechariah Sitchin.
Yeah, is he sitchiniswrong.com?
Sitchiniswrong.com.
Yeah,
it's a very useful site. So
I hated him and loved him at the same time. I was so sad. I love the idea of the aliens come down and manipulating the monkeys and making us to mine gold. It's a wonderful story.
But unfortunately, it's a work of science fiction. It's not a work of fact.
Damn it, Zechariah.
I knew him. He was a fascinating man. I once drove him from Stonehenge to London. We had many conversations. He was a deep and serious researcher, but I think he got carried away with his own fantasy.
I also think that fantasy became very lucrative, and it also became a source of identity to him.
Yeah.
I followed him pretty closely as well. I've read The 12th Planet, and I got really into his research. And this is in my early pot smoking days. When I first started smoking pot, so I was all in. I was all in.
Yeah.
And then as I got wiser, and then as I got, I don't know, maybe not wiser, just I started recognizing objectively why these things are so attractive. The fantastical is more attractive than the practical, and so
something else. Again, I don't want to put Sitchin down, and I'm here also to say that Sitchin did a lot of really good work. He was a clever guy, and he did a lot of very, very, very thorough research. I've just lost my track actually smoking too much dope. Where was I going?
Well, we were talking about the difference between the fantastical and the practical, that there's this inclination to accept things that are fun.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, is that when you start talking about the Anunnaki, those from heaven to earth came, these fantastic creatures from...
Thank you. You brought my memory back. I remembered what I was going to say. What's interesting... Could be good. What's interesting is that the level of technology that Zechariah attributes to the Anunnaki oblique Nephilim, that level of technology is the level of technology that we had in the 1970s when we were, NASA was doing its stuff. So it's NASA technology from the 1970s that is projected out onto, that is projected out onto his theory of the past. Now, it seems to be very unlikely that the Nephilim or the Anunnaki would have had for 400,000 years, which is what he's saying, the same technology that NASA had in the 1970s. It's much more likely that he's projecting that onto the data rather than that it's actually inherent in the data.
There was also some interesting ideas that he had that turned out to be ideas that scientists had also proposed about preserving our atmosphere by levitating or by suspending reflective particles in our atmosphere. And that is something that the Anunnaki, in his books, were going to use gold for, because gold has such unique properties, which is why they use gold to plate things, because you can take a little tiny piece of gold, you can plate this entire table. Gold's a really spectacular piece of, it's just, there's nothing like it, right?
Absolutely. No, there's a lot of really good material in situ, but unfortunately the translations of the texts are not translations of the text. They misrepresent the text. Often what he did was he took a 19th century translation and he massaged it so that it would fit his argument, and that's a pity. So we need skeptics, and they help us to sift out the wheat from the chaff. But occasionally what the skeptics do with this drive to criticize anything that's not mainstream, occasionally what they do is they let go of a really good idea, which deserves investigation and which the human species could benefit from. And that's my feeling, is we're this amazing species, we've developed all this science, Why are we so ready to let go of wonderful ideas?
Well, it's also fascinating to me that because of what Sitchin has been sort of criticized for, people now ignore the stuff that's absolutely undeniable, like the actual stone tablets themselves, the clay tablets, where you can see the depictions of the solar system. Somehow or another, these people from 6,000 plus years ago had a detailed map of the solar system.
It's a clear idea of the solar system.
With the size in like a relatively correct order, and the planets in the right place. Like they somehow or another knew that Jupiter was bigger than Mars. They knew these things in some weird way, and we don't know why. We don't know how. Also, the caduceus representing the double helix of the DNA. That's a really fascinating concept too. That the caduceus is used for medicine. And it's used to. It's just he had some really interesting points. Zechariah did. So it's kind of too bad there was so much crazy involved in that.
I think what any of us should do when we're exploring the deep and hidden mysteries of the past is to go to a lot of different sources. Don't just stick with the mainstream. Don't just stick with the alternative, but try to bring it all together. And in a way, that's what I try to do in my books, except the skeptics still hate them.
Yeah, but it's just so hard because it's so fun to go with the crazy story.
Yeah,
like the alien story is so compelling. It's so fun.
Very compelling story.
I mean, if we found some sort of evidence of aliens, it would be so utterly spectacular. Even if it was a simple alien. Like I've always said this, that if we found like a jellyfish on the moon, we would freak out. But there's really complex, bizarre things at the bottom of our ocean that we've never discovered because they're just not in the correct location for us to be excited.
And then the other issue, we get slightly off our flood topic here, but the other issue of entities, that the encounters with entities, anybody who's smoked DMT will know that, as I have, as you have, that will know that you do encounter entities in the DMT state, and they do communicate with us. And there's a lot of parallels with the ETs or the aliens as they're described in modern UFO abduction accounts. And Rick Strassman, have you ever had him on your show?
Rick got sick. He was supposed to be here a couple of times. We're trying to reschedule it now. Yeah. But he had some pretty serious health issues. I know. We had a date scheduled out, but I love that guy. I had a chance to sit down with him a couple of times and talk to him.
And of course, you presented DMT.
Yeah, he's brilliant, and he's so important to me because I remember when I did it, I was so confused. I mean, to me, it was like my first DMT experience changed everything I thought about the world, and I immediately didn't give a shit about aliens anymore. Right? Like it was almost instantaneous. Like before that, I was like, Roswell, they got the ship, man. Yeah. It's in a hangar. But what I encountered doing DMT was so spectacularly alien that the pedestrian concept of something that looks like a person but has a bigger head and large eyes
and higher tech. Yeah.
It was as weird and cool as it would be if it was real. It was nothing. I mean, literally not 1/1,000,000th as interesting as what you absolutely can encounter when you do DMT. That's the aliens.
That's the aliens, an utterly alien realm filled with alien intelligences who communicate. Of course, again, the skeptics say, it's all just made up in your brain, but we don't know that. And Rick is open to the possibility that we are dealing with areas of reality that are not normally accessible to our senses, and that become accessible to our senses by retuning the receiver wavelength of the brain, which is what he suggests DMT does. And I think that's very plausible. And at the very least, those who are interested in UFOs and aliens should be also investigating this line of inquiry. Can we use changes in consciousness to understand the majestic complexity of the universe in which we live? And I think the answer is definitely yes. And many of Rick's volunteers, I paraphrase, but they came back with reports that the entities who'd encountered them said, "We are so glad you discovered this technology. Now we can communicate with you much more easily." It's fascinating. So there's a technology for encountering other intelligences, and against that, this mechanistic, simplistic alien meme that's going around now that they're a bit like us, but they came here in higher tech. It's dull by comparison.
It is dull by comparison. If you're interested, the book is amazing. It's called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and he has a new book that he's putting out about
DMT and the Spirit and the Solar Prophecy.
And he's just a really, really interesting guy. His experiments that he did were the first, I think, in many, many decades to get approved by the government.
Correct.
So he did everything above ground. I mean, he was above board. He
did, and because it was government approved, his remit was that he had to find some therapeutic benefit for DMT. DMT, and he couldn't actually. But that's not the point.
Yeah.
I'm sure actually there are therapeutic benefits, but that's not the point. The point is here is a tool for investigating the mystery of consciousness and the mysterious nature of reality. And I mean, fuck me, if we get 5 or 6 volunteers who haven't compared notes, all coming back who've met entities who said, we're so happy you found this technology.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain that as just to reduce it to brain activity.
Not only that, when we talk about things that are so big and are ignored by mainstream culture, this is one that's just like that. You're talking about an endogenous human chemical that not only is in us, but is in thousands of different plants. Like, I mean, how many different plants contain DMT?
Huge number.
Huge number.
Very prosaic ones like peas and,
Well, there's the amazing story.
Acacia.
That's what I was going to say.
The
There's
Australian
story.
national tree is actually illegal.
Isn't that, but the Jerusalem, the professors from the University of Jerusalem, I believe,
Benny Shannon.
and what they were talking about, they believe that that's what the story of the burning bush of Moses is.
So that is mimosa with the DMT and Syrian rue with the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. In other words, it's ayahuasca, but a Middle Eastern alternative of it, doing the same thing molecularly.
And isn't it possible in some way that the idea of the burning bush was them how to dry or extract DMT and burn it?
Very likely.
Very possibly, right? Because they're talking about the burning bush producing God, and it just so happens that this bush is, the acacia tree is incredibly common and super rich in DMT, and it's all over the area.
And I should probably insert at this point that if you're at all familiar with the Masonic ritual, you'll know that the acacia plant plays a central role.
That's right. You're one of them 1% Mason characters.
Every now and then on Facebook, Randall, I get accused of being a Freemason. Hancock is a Freemason. As though it explains everything. I know lots of Freemasons. I've spoken in Masonic lodges, but I'm an author and I shouldn't belong to clubs.
I went to a wedding that my friend Duncan Trussell was performing at for these two Satanists in like 2003, and to this day, it was one of the LeVays, Anton LeVay or Stanton LeVay, whatever is his son. And his son got married. It was some young hedonist, and they call themselves Satanists. And so Duncan performed at this wedding, and I went there. To this day, I get fucking tweets about being a Satanist. So I can't join your little club, pal. I can't be one of your Masons.
I need to confess you, Graham.
Yes.
You didn't realize this, but I secretly initiated you.
Oh my God! Oh, you're in.
So you get in. Have you secretly initiated somebody? Can you do that? For real?
No.
Oh, okay.
I sort of did.
Sort of? So you could get him in if you wanted to, though, right? If you know the people.
Oh, of course.
There you go.
Even you, Joe.
I don't think so. I met a couple of Masons. They're very cool.
Well, most Masons don't really understand the corpus of symbolism that they're sitting on top of. I got to say that. Not to get off on the Freemasons, but simply there's a mass of symbolism, and that's the whole. That's the thing that they're custodians of, and most of them don't have a clue what it means. But they're doing an important job by preserving this corpus of symbolism through the layout of the lodge, the meaning of every component in the lodge, because it's a purely astronomical allegory. And then you have the Masonic carpets, and that's where you have the whole story of the comet, the flood. It's all there. The acacia plant, it's all there.
It's all, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's all also an integral part of how Washington, D.C. was designed. Is that true?
Yeah, to some extent. I honestly haven't studied that much.
What I've seen is that there's a bunch of videos where you can watch it where they sort of describe how the layout, is in some way some sort of sacred geometry.
I think that's
what it's based on.
The Freemasons were massively involved in the construction of Washington, as they were of many great cities. The city I live in England has got, major Masonic architecture.
So is it like people like me, like my initial prejudice, I hear something like the Masons, like, fucking dude's in a cult, get out of here, leave me alone. Like, we assume that all groups of people that follow anything somehow or another are wacky.
Masons, in my opinion, they're largely a drinking club for men. Mainly that's what it is.
Guys don't let women in at all?
But you can make special arrangements to bring women into it. For example, my wife's, when I've given a talk in a lodge, I've given talks in 2 or 3 lodges, been asked to do so, then they make a special ceremony to allow my wife Santa to come in, because I won't go anywhere without Santa. And so women can go in, but then there are others within Masonry who are pursuing deeply esoteric interests and exploring the mysteries, and you can have incredible conversations. So it's just another group of people who are doing their thing. It's not for me. I wouldn't join. I would lose. I think if I joined Freemasonry, it would weaken me as an author. I think I'm better able to comment on these things by not being a member of any such group.
That's interesting. Why do you think that?
Well, because I think I have to remain open to all possibilities, and if I commit myself to a particular line, I don't commit myself to a particular religion. I don't commit myself to a particular men's club either. Which is what Masonry is. I think if I commit that there, but then ultimately I would become a spokesperson for that, and I don't want to be that.
That makes a lot of sense considering your occupation and how important being open-minded has been to your life.
It's vital. It's absolutely.
Without it, how could you have ever done Fingerprints of the Gods?
I could not.
You have to. I mean, and the initial thing where you were telling me about Ethiopia, that place where they believe that the Ark of the Covenant lays, which is one of the most bizarre ideas ever.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was my first book on the historical mystery, was The Sign of the Seal.
To try and go into it, like, it's so interesting. But I've always imagined you as a young guy forced to sort of reconcile with this bizarre piece of evidence. You've got these old men that have cataracts in their eyes, like they're on radiation sites, and no one's allowed to go inside and see this thing, and they claim they have the Ark of the Covenant in there. I'm like, what the fuck is in there?
It was the beginning of a magical journey for me.
It's been a magical journey for your fans too, for guys like me, man. When I read Favorites of the Gods, it was one of those books I just couldn't put down. It was so mind-blowing. And this, again, was in the heart of my fucking aliens, man.
Fingerprints was published in 1995, and Magicians came out in 2015. And I would say at that time, the evidence, when I made the case for a lost civilization and a global cataclysm in Fingerprints of the Gods, I can't begin to account for the amount of hostility and anger and rage that I generated in the academic community. The idea was considered to be absolutely absurd. 20 years later, with Magicians of the Gods, it's not so absurd anymore. The evidence is mounting. We have incredible evidence now for a global cataclysm in exactly the period that counts, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. We have sites like Göbekli Tepe, we have a redefinition of the Sphinx. The whole area is just about to explode in the future. We're on the edge, I believe, of a paradigm shift, and this comic material is central to it.
What I really appreciate about your courage is that you've also had the courage to admit when you've made mistakes. Yeah. You don't in any way pretend to be some sort of bearer of secret knowledge that no one else possesses.
I'm absolutely not a guru. I don't want to be anything like that. I'm a reporter. That's what I am. I'm a reporter who's reporting on offbeat subjects, and to some extent, I'm an outsider. So one of the talks I do now is about being an outsider. I think there is a place for outsiders in society.
Well, I don't think you're an outsider. I think you're an outsider from the established mainstream ideas. I just think that ideas
are the same. We're both outsiders in that area, working in different fields to get into this.
But don't you think that these established channels that were so deeply grooved in distributing information, those things have widened so wide now? Where you're getting, a professor could do a podcast, like he could teach a class, and he could write a book, or he can do a podcast on a certain subject. And like, you're aware of Dan Carlin and that Hardcore History podcast, which I just can't stop raving about. Well, what he's done is brought historical, accurate, but really dramatic stories of real events that took place to millions. Like, that's just, that no one's doing that. Like, but it's not mainstream. Well, what's more mainstream than being number one on the iTunes podcast list, which he is all the time? What is more mainstream? And he must be getting millions of downloads.
It's part of the big changes taking place in our society. That the old structures are being overthrown. They're being thrown away. It's a very uncomfortable time. It's a very uncertain time. It's a very exciting time. Right. Because we can build out of this something amazing in the future. The internet's had a huge part to play in it. The fact that people can communicate with one another all around the world.
Well, since I've had a web presence in the last, I was a late comer, but maybe 2 to 3 years ago, I've been getting contacted by, professionals from around the world. I've got probably a dozen major ones. Geologists who want to know more about it. And interesting, you said earlier about debating. I'm always looking for somebody to debate on this.
Right.
Because I have questions, and I'm thinking maybe somebody who would disagree with me on something could still help me answer some of those questions.
Right.
But I try to associate as much as possible and hang out with professionals in the field. And of course, what I discover is that a lot of them are working in these things part-time, almost clandestinely, without making it part of their, if I go on a field trip with geologists into the floodlands, none of them are really working on it full-time. It's all part-time. They're working for the government, they're working for the oil companies, or, exploration, mineral exploration, whatever. They're doing this research into geological catastrophes on their own time.
Right.
But recently, just last summer, I got invited to actually present some of my research to the Atlanta Geological Society, which is the largest society of professional geologists in the Southeast. So I jumped at the chance rather than, and so I presented hoping that I would get challenged and somebody would say, wait a second, there's a flaw in your thinking. Didn't happen.
So did you make friends with some of these mainstream geologists?
Oh yeah, well I didn't know, when I just took a trip for, in September, spent 10 days back out in the floodlands. And I had a geologist with me on that trip. So yeah, I'm getting to know more and more people who are working as, well, I majored in geology. So I still am in touch regularly with the head of the geology department. I see her pretty much on a regular basis and have been keeping her apprised of some of my stuff. And she has offered to sponsor me at whatever point I think that I can pull it together as a dissertation. But we'll see how that goes. My objective was to learn geology, not to become a professional geologist. I wasn't interested in working for the government or working for, the energy industry. I had geological questions, and that's why I majored in geology.
And you walk the walk. And in my opinion, you know more about this stuff than 10 fully PhD geologists.
Yeah, you always freak me out. So what's fascinating to me about all of this is that I think what you've done has been very measured. Everything you back up with facts and photographs and descriptions and disclaimers. When you say, well, it is possible, you will go down other various paths. You're not dogmatic about these ideas, but you've spent so much time going over this. I don't know if there's a commensurate guy in mainstream archaeology that has been public about the way you have been. Because if there is, I feel like we probably would have heard about them. Your podcasts have been, the ones that we've done, they've been seen by millions of people. They've been listened to by millions of people. The information's getting out there and
making a real difference.
You're always going to have the guys, like I think Michael Shermer's very important. I'm not criticizing him, but that knee-jerk reaction to do something, to mock something or put down something that's not mainstream. Like one of his tweets, he said, you know what archaeology with evidence is, when he wrote archaeology. Like, why would you even tweet that? That doesn't even make any sense. Like, that's someone who's not paying attention to your work.
That makes it
all you do is focus on evidence.
I'm reminded of the Shakespearean line, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Why does he need to say that it's got evidence? It's like, Fox News saying fair and balanced.
He's tweeting at you with this.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, your entire book is based on photographic evidence and all the other various pieces of evidence. Examining all these pieces of evidence. It's not things that you invented. These are actually real sites that you can look at.
I'm drawing inferences from them that they don't like. That's the thing.
Well, Robert Schoch and guys like him are so important. Guys who have the courage, who's a Boston University professor, absolutely. Look at the stones and say, this is the product of water erosion.
Kudos to Robert Schoch as a geologist, a career academic geologist who's taken that risk and put himself out there and followed the evidence where it leads. Another one is Danny Gilman and Natalie Jaja in Indonesia, who's been responsible for the investigation of this extraordinary site at Gunung Padang, where work has been stopped since 2014. Again, he's a highly credentialed geologist. He's Indonesia's leading expert in semi-thrust earthquakes, but he's been looking at archaeology, bringing his geological expertise to that. So things are changing. We are finding academics who are willing to engage and willing to discuss. I got into a very interesting email correspondence with a guy called Daniel Lohmann at Balme from the German Archaeological Institute, who's an architect and an archaeologist, and he was very civil with me. He answered my question. We went into it in depth. We had quite a long debate. That's very refreshing. That kind of thing wasn't happening 20 years ago.
Yeah, that is very refreshing. Now, what about those pyramids in Bosnia? Has that been, what is the deal with that? Are those things?
I've been there. I know Sam Oswanagic personally. Sam is the guy who's promoted the site. I like Sam very much. I must say, when I meet his aura, I'm extremely convinced. But when I look rationally at the so-called pyramids, I don't think they're pyramids. I think they're pyramids. I did spend with Sam showing him around. I did spend 3 days in Bosnia looking at the so-called pyramids, the same pyramid of the moon, and the last pyramid, and so on and so forth. I do see that the tourist industry is built up around this, and it's a fabulously beautiful, intriguing site, massive, beautiful, mountainous place, but they are hills, they are not pyramids. The impression is given that there are tunnels, passageways inside the pyramids. That's not true. The passageways are about 2.5 kilometers away. They're very low tech. I just don't see it, and for that reason, I did not cover the Bosnian pyramids and magicians of the gods. I'm not going to say they're not pyramids. I'm not going to write a book saying that they're wrong, but they didn't excite me enough to justify devoting a chapter to them. There's much more exciting and important archaeological discoveries that are being made, like Göbekli Tepe, which need more space.
And there's some pyramid-like structures or hills in China as well, right?
There's thousands of pyramids in China. Xi'an, the province of Xi'an, is just one land there. Your aircraft, you see pyramids everywhere. There are certainly hundreds and hundreds of them, distributed across fields, vanishing off into the distance in all directions. They've been terraced and used as agriculture. Local farmers grow crops on them. I went there with Chinese archaeologists. They haven't excavated a single one. Not one.
Why not?
They said, we don't have, this was nearly 10 years ago I was there, they said they've probably got the money now, but they said then they didn't have the money. They said, we're an old country, we don't mind if we wait 200 years to get to grips with this.
Jesus Christ.
And the famous tomb of the first emperor is part of this pattern. It is also a pyramid, it has also not been excavated. The terracotta army around it has been found.
The terracotta army. It was on display somewhere, wasn't it? Where you can go and see it.
Yeah, it is.
I want to see that thing. I want to look at those things. What a bizarre concept. Now, these pyramids, so this one that this emperor was buried in that had the terracotta army, was that a pyramid as well?
It is a pyramid.
It is.
Absolutely. It's a man-made pyramid. The terracotta army was buried around its edges, not in the pyramid itself.
So the army was there to protect him?
Yeah, to protect his soul into the afterlife seems to be the idea. And then there's a mythology that's come down that within the pyramid is a lake of virtue, that there are mechanical devices in there which will fire arrows at you if you go in. There's a whole story about how intensely protected it is, and up to this day it's not been excavated.
That's so crazy. How could someone leave that alone?
And even major archaeological sites like Tiwanaku in Bolivia, for example, you find that only about 2% of the site has been excavated. I don't know how we can draw inferences about the whole site from a timing perspective like that. And that's the problem, I think, with archaeology, and it's why we have to consider it everywhere.
We're looking at an image of the terracotta army now in front of this pyramid, and it is spectacular. Now that I think about it, I don't think that was on display anywhere. I think maybe they had a couple of them.
They brought some of them. They came to the British Museum. There were a number of museums.
But it's so much bigger than I thought it was. I mean, how many? There's thousands. Yeah, there's thousands of these terracotta figures. Absolutely. And this pyramid was made out of what? The stone?
Around earth,
Okay. So they just sort of shaped the ground. They just dug around.
Yeah, they caught in it and turned it into a pyramidal ground.
But it wasn't.
It's not massive stone blocks. It's not massive stone. That's why they can grow crops on the sides of some of the
Wow, how weird.
Yeah.
So they would build these giant mounds of dirt and then dig holes in them and support them.
Well, they probably created the interior, subterranean as they were building the whole thing.
And they just stacked dirt on top of it.
Yeah.
Wow, what a weird way to make a house.
And we have to consider this with archaeological sites all around the world, is that any site may actually not be the product of just one culture, but may have been reworked and worked over and used by many different cultures over
This is
different periods.
stunning to me. I found out about this because of a friend, John Anthony West, who's here with him. He showed me, he lives in China, and showed me some video of this. And I was like, how do I not know about this? I had no idea there's this many. So here's one that's exposed.
business
What's this?
right then and there.
Controversial ancient pyramids of China.
That one
Yeah.
looks exposed.
It's that one looks blocky. Yeah.
Well, that is another thing about China that we just don't have a clue. When we think about the age and scale of things, we're so silly. We've only been around since 1776 when the country was established. It's not really that long ago. You're dealing with China, you're dealing with literally thousands of years of civilization, all rising and falling and taking place and adapting and growing, all in this one area. It's still in our eyes. In a lot of ways, it's kind of behind, right? I mean, they're behind environmentally, they're behind when it comes to human rights. Consider this.
The 95-year-old brother.
In the late 1400s,
He's a valued member of this
had rounded
company.
the Cape of Good Hope.
And you know
They
what? He
entered
knows
the
more about
Indian
business than you ever
in their
will.
little ships. They entered the Indian Ocean and they actually established a huge
I
empire.
did
They
not
go
go to
to
business school.
Malacca,
No,
they go all
Russell,
over
go
the
to business
place,
school.
okay? The seas are open to them. If they had come 40 years earlier, they would have encountered the Chinese treasure ships. Ships that were 50 times larger than the little caravels that the Portuguese were sailing. But you know what the Chinese did at that time? They went through a period where they felt they just wanted to give gifts to people. And they put together these huge fleets carrying incredibly precious gifts, silks and ceramics, and they took them all around the Indian Ocean and they just gave them to people. So off the coast of East Africa and East Africa, you can find remains of this pottery from this episode. And then a Chinese emperor came along and he closed the doors. He burned all the boats, shut everything down, and didn't let anybody speak to China for 200 years. Whoa, what a dick.
Well, he felt that it was time for the Chinese culture to turn against them.
Yeah.
And they were afraid that their ancient culture, on one hand, there might have been maybe a laudable motive in that they were concerned that the ancient culture was going to get contaminated by too much contact with degenerate cultures from other places, and that was a factor in it.
That constant desire to maintain the current situation.
Human, we have to say it's some kind of human nature.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd love to see some of these images of
Yeah, let's look at
the drone stuff from the Camas Prairie and what
Yeah,
is
let's please.
and let's have a look at it. You got that?
I want to get that to show
this
this
Chinese pyramid is still blowing my mind.
They blow my mind as well.
I can't believe they haven't been excavated.
It's an eerie, spooky scene. I mean, I recommend anybody to go to see it. And just, it's incredible how many of them there are, and how unexplained it all is. And it's again, it feeds into my general point because we don't remember.
What are we looking at here?
Can we pause so I can talk about what we're looking at?
Yeah, you look at this one. That way you can hit the mic right in front of you.
Okay, this is the beginning. Okay, here's what we're
Put that
looking
mic
at.
right up to
We're looking at a place in western Montana called Camas Prairie. You see some hills in the foreground and you see a basin in the back. Right? Okay, right here on top of this hill and down on the side here, you see that there are some quarrying operations. Those are quarrying gravel. Because everything you're looking at here, this whole landscape between the hills are these large masses of grass, now, what we're going to do is we're going to start sweeping around as the video plays, and you're going to notice down here a series of ripples.
Oh, okay, I see that.
Okay, and I'm going to have Jamie pause in a second, but let's keep coming around. You start seeing the ripples on the landscape. Let's pause right here. Right here, let's pause. Now, I wish I had a pointer, but if you look up, you're going to see a flat piece of land like a tongue coming out, rounded. Yeah, Jamie's. Right here.
That's it. Get your laser.
That's a delta. That's a delta. You know what a delta is? You ever heard of the delta? It's when a river comes into a body of water and it's carrying sediment. And because the river is moving along swiftly, it's carrying the sediment, but when it comes into the standing body of water, it slows down and it drops its sediment and builds a delta. The whole city of Portland, for example, is built on a giant delta. Right? New Orleans is built on a delta. Right? Okay, so what we're seeing here is a delta. And then in front of us, we're seeing rippled landscape. Let's keep coming around, Jamie.
So rippled landscape that looks exactly like the beach looks.
Yeah, keep coming around.
That's the thing, it's fractal, because this is the whole mystery of this, that this happens at the scale of inches on beaches and the scale of hundreds of feet.
Stop again. Okay. Now, right here in the middle, you see a massive delta.
Yes.
You know, like a big tongue splayed Then right down here, you start seeing the ripples. And there's a farmhouse. You see the farmhouse there? Now those ripples are, the tallest ones are about the height of a 5-story building.
How bizarre.
Okay, let's keep swinging around here.
Stop this for a second, if you don't mind. So these things, they're the size of a 5-story building. What is that, like 70 feet or something like that? 50 feet? Okay. So those are 50 feet high. And how much water?
We'll get to that. Let's see the rest of it.
And these are just dirt, right?
They're well. If you dig into one, what you're going to find is they're a massive. Let's pause again. Look at this.
This is crazy.
This is totally crazy. This is one of the craziest things you'll ever see.
These ripples, repeated ripples in an area where there's nothing else like it.
This is the fingerprints of the flood. That's what it is.
Wow. Where can someone look at this? How does someone look at this?
In real?
You know, this right now, this is what we're looking at. This is this video.
Well, my colleague Brad Young did this with his drone. And I think he's got it on the website, Geocosmic Brad.
Is this being played in the YouTube video right now? Okay. All right. So the YouTube people are cool with it. If you're listening on iTunes, find it on YouTube. But it's worth looking at. It's my point. This is mind-blowing shit.
And I think you made the crucial point, Joe, which is that we can understand what this is because we can see it on any beach. We can see how water flows receding across a sandy medium will produce ripples. But here, they're on this unbelievable scale where they're hundreds of feet long and 50 feet high, where they dwarf houses, and they're lying all across. And what that tells us is that a huge water flow went across this plain and did this.
Well, seeing it from this perspective above, which is a rare perspective unless you're in a plane or a helicopter or something, you get a chance to look at it this way, you really get a better sense of what it is. If you were on the ground there, you'd probably say, oh, look at all the hills. It's hard to see.
You don't quite get the impression, we did visit this location, and to that day it was overcast, so you don't quite get the effect like you do when you've got low sun angle. Mm-hmm. Really helps you to see what's going on in the landscape.
Can I ask you, is there a dispute to this? Is there a
no, nobody disputes it. Nobody disputes this from a flood. Not anymore. Wow. No. In fact, it was this. JT.
Nobody disputes that it was caused by massive water flow.
Exactly.
But those same people would still not buy into the notion that there was this one enormous flood.
Okay, so they think it's a cumulative effect, but this was all created.
This was the one of Lake Missoula, right?
Yeah, and this is supposed to actually represent the drain. Whereas I argue from a number of different reasons that this is the filler.
I have a friend of mine who, his friend lives in Montana, and they found a dinosaur on his ranch. Oh, wow. Yeah, really recently.
There's the connection.
Yeah, the Great Western Inland Sea, all that area, there was, to me, this is a crazy place at one point in time.
It still is.
Yeah. In a different way.
The water here, Joe, the way to visualize this is to begin to think of tsunami. You have to think tsunami because tsunami is the closest scale of water flow that we've experienced in modern times. No river flood has even approached this. Yeah, no flood in any floodplain, nothing we can put into perspective. Right. The closest we can get to it is a tsunami. But even there, you got to picture the tsunamis that we've experienced in the last decade, in Indonesia, Japan. When they made landfall, those tsunamis were roughly between 20 and 50 feet, depending on where you were relative to the oncoming wave and how far distant you were from it. Here, what you have to visualize is a tsunami sweeping over the land that's over 1,000 feet deep. That's what happened here.
Ladies and gentlemen,
And we know that because we can trace the high water marks on the hillsides are clearly left. The high water marks are clearly etched into the hillsides. So we now know, based upon the study of the ripples, and the water here was moving down. It's filling this basin. It's rushing in a great tsunami from the north of fresh water, meltwater, coming off the ice sheet. And it's sweeping down over this land at probably 200 or 300 million cubic feet per second, which is an inconceivable amount of water. It's many times in excess of every river flowing on Earth, flowing today all at once. It's beyond that many times, 10 or 20 times beyond that.
one of the trickier things about water is that water in itself is kind of fractal in some sort of weird way. When you look at the actual molecules of water, it's almost like we don't distinguish it as being a fractal thing, because we see it as like this union flow. But if you're looking at the actual molecules of water, the cup of water that you dip your fingers in, which is seemingly completely innocuous, becomes this massive element of change when the volume is 1,000 feet high and is rolling over with massive amounts of weight behind it. It's that same stuff.
Massive amounts of weight. Enough weight, and it's actually causing seismic responses in.
Keep talking about this, that can create these 50-foot high walls. But what's fascinating to me is that we don't have a scale like in our minds as a reference, like the difference between that little cup and these gigantic waves that you see that surfers travel by jet ski to get to, off of I believe it's Mexico.
Right.
You've seen those massive waves. They go way out, miles out to get to these crazy waves, and they ride them to like 60, 70 feet high. Like that's the comparison, almost like a glass of water to those waves, and then that to this.
It scales up, it scales up, it scales up, and at a certain point it can change the whole story of civilization.
Almost doesn't compute. Like you can intellectualize it, but it's almost not computing.
One of these flood flows here is 3 orders of magnitude greater than the largest measured modern flood. In other words, over 1,000 times greater. In terms of peak discharge or volume, you would have to scale up at least 1,000 times greater than any modern measured flood to get to the smallest, really, of these flows here. Because this is just one place, one locale on 5 states where you can trace literally an ocean of fresh water sweeping across the entire Pacific Northwest, pretty much washing away anything that was there.
It's almost like we have a defense mechanism built in where we ignore how vulnerable we really are. Like we put it, maybe that's one of the reasons why people are so reluctant to really go deep into studying asteroidal impacts,
I think
or even to pay attention to this stuff. Like that this could happen.
And this is, those are not 2 separate subjects, because this is the result of the comet impact on the ice cap. This is why I feel that the research in this field is so vital.
Okay, right there. Yeah. Now here, notice.
This is crazy. That's a beach.
Yeah, but it's a beach. It's a beach for giant monsters. Is what it is. You can see in this here that you've actually got 3 massive currents converging here. Do you see that? Over here on the right, you've got a massive current coming in that would be from the west, and then we would be standing looking down current. First, the drone I'm guessing here is about 200 feet in elevation. So the top of the water was another 800 to 900 feet above this perspective right here. And it's moving very, very fast. And it's sweeping down into a river valley that's down in those mountains you see in the distance. Mm-hmm. And from there, it's being carried down and joining up other equally as large floods coming in from other valleys. And all of this is happening at once, and it's covering 5 states, basically. And that's just one region that's being affected by this sudden catastrophic melting of the ice sheets.
We are dealing with the largest flood that ever occurred on Earth. It's as simple as that.
This is insane. I mean, it's insane to look at.
And it happened here in North America, and it happened 12,800 years ago, and its story has yet to be fully told.
Isn't it possible there was something larger before, like the 65 million year ago one that hit the Yucatan? Like, what kind of an impact did that have?
Well, it actually would have, because if that had happened 12,000 years ago, we wouldn't be having.
None of us would be here.
Yeah, that'd be a wrap, right?
Yeah, that was a single large object, about 6 miles wide. That was a much more devastating impact than the impacts of 12,800 years ago. But nevertheless, those impacts of 12,800 years ago were really, really bad, and they did stuff like this. And anything that was in the way of these massive flows of water, would have been rubbed completely from the story.
See, this all makes sense.
Yeah, and here's the thing that the Michael Shermers don't get. When you understand the extent of this, the scale of this phenomenon, and the severity, the inconceivable severity of this, in the aftermath of an event like this, what would remain of of a city, a village.
A refrigerator.
No, not a goddamn thing.
Not
Nothing.
Not much.
Nothing would exist in the aftermath of this.
And most things wouldn't exist. I mean, you find like an old refrigerator or a car up on blocks in someone's backyard in the South, and it's the 1970s, and the rot has gotten into the frame.
Nature's going to eat it up.
Yeah, nature's eating it up just in a couple of decades.
Right.
What's it going to be like in a couple thousand years?
We should not be surprised about how little we really know about our past. This is also a comfort game with archaeology. Oh yeah, we've got the past all worked out. We understand it. Here it is. This is what we teach in schools. This is what our friends in the media report. This is the fact. It's not the facts. We know nothing. It's that there's been so much lost, so many missing pieces of the puzzle that we're desperately trying to stitch together. And it's important, I think, that we actually do get some clarity on events like this, because we still live on this planet and we have kids and we have a future, and we want to hopefully
One of those big boys comes our way.
Well, that's right. But again, I come down to this, which is that we are not dealing with gloom and doom at the end of the world. We're dealing with a problem that humanity should be confronting. We should not be sticking our heads in the sand. We should be confronting this problem. And that's why I support the work of the Comet Research Group, because they are the only people right now who are confronting this problem and really getting to grips with it.
We should all confront. I mean, we should absolutely all support them and confront it, because if something like this can happen once, what really makes sense is how many stories of floods there are in ancient times, and how many parallels there are,
and how many there are from North America.
Oh, dozens and dozens. Yeah, it was the Indian artist who spent 30 years or so pre-Civil War, I think maybe a decade after the Civil War, painting Indians of different tribes. And he wrote a book called Last Rambles Among the North American Indians. Very, very interesting book. But what really is interesting to me when I read the book years and years ago was his final conclusion of the book. He says, after all of these different customs and traditions have been handed down amongst these tribes, they all have one thing in common. They all have a memory or a story of a gigantic world-destroying flood. And this was concluded tribes down into Central America that he visited.
I believe the Americas are the repository, the Native American peoples who have been subjected to so much destruction over the years. They, in their mythology, their traditions, their memories, they keep more of this than almost anybody else. It's really tragic what has happened in the Americas from the time of the Spanish conquest. The deliberate destruction of knowledge, the terrible, horrendous abuses that Native American people suffer. They are our wisdom keepers. They are the people who pass down the oral tradition and remember the past. So not only do we have cataclysms wiping the human memory, but we ourselves actively get involved in the human memory and wipe it. We rub it out. The burning of the Maya codices by the Spanish friars, thousands and thousands. God knows what was in those documents.
Yeah.
We might have had a whole other story about ourselves if we could have had access to those, but instead we're this destructive, cannibalistic species that just goes and smashes everything to bits.
It's a weird impulse that human beings have, is when they move into an area and they take over it, one of the things they like to do is destroy their icons.
Destroy everything.
What's going on with ISIS and all these ancient Buddhist structures,
Yes,
these 1,000-plus-year-old beautiful sculptures,
Absolutely.
they're blowing them up, and yelling praise God while they're doing it. It's really very bizarre. It's a very bizarre inclination that we have. It's almost like we don't want people to know. It's this bizarre, almost human instinct to wipe out the past, just to constantly keep moving forward.
Or is there some trauma? Is there some collective trauma, some deeply suppressed memory that we can't quite confront?
That's exactly the thought I had, because I think that's the one of those areas where Velikovsky finally really nailed it was mankind in amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow we carry the trauma, because once you begin to get a handle and you get the picture of these events as they occurred and did occur and would have been experienced by our ancestors, you've got to understand, what would it be like to see your entire world completely obliterated, starting over again from basically a barren mud field?
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what these people were faced with.
If they lived at all. And
So obviously they did, because here we are. But, again, the evidence is emerging of major cultural collapse.
If you had a guess, what percentage of the population of human beings, just as obviously just a guess, but how many do you think were wiped out? Half of them? 3/4 of them?
I don't think that would be unrealistic. No.
It doesn't seem like it would be. And if it was that number, and those people, that's enough for people to survive And if it was that number, boy, what a strange fucking mythical past they would have.
The other thing to bear in mind is, in the world today, our world, we have an advanced civilization. America, Germany, the industrialized technological countries. And we have coexisting with them in South America, in the Namibian desert, we have hunter-gatherers. So the notion that hunter-gatherers and an advanced civilization might coexist in the same epoch of history should not be strange to us, because we're doing that today. And that's what I would suggest happened before 12,800 years ago, before the cataclysm of 12,800 years ago, that there was a fairly advanced civilization that was capable of mapping and exploring the world, and creating gigantic works of architecture, and it coexisted with hunter-gatherers. And who were the ones who survived the cataclysm? The answer is the ones who survived the cataclysm were the hunter-gatherers, not the sophisticated peoples. A few of them survived, and they then settled amongst the hunter-gatherers and tried to transfer some of their knowledge and skills to them. And it's the same today. If we were to have a repeat of the Younger Dryas cataclysm today, I don't think that people from Los Angeles or London would be amongst the leading survivors. I think the survivors would be people like the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon rainforest, because they're in the business of surviving. That's what they do. It's not a mystery to them. It's not even a problem. They do it all the time. They would carry the human story forward. And 10,000 years from now, their descendants would be telling a myth about how there was once a great civilization on this planet, so advanced that they could even go to the moon. They could fly around the planet. They could speak to one another on other sides of the earth. But they did something